In Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, there is a teaching that when you eat a food, whether it's a vegetable or an egg or an animal, you elevate the energy from that animal, the soul of that thing, as it were, to a higher level of consciousness through the process of eating it and using the energy of that animal for good deeds. But does this work today? In the old stories, you have an actual interaction with the animal in some way, shape, or form. The animal appears, shows up at your doorstep, or a great saint converses with it somehow on a mystical level, and this animal's soul needs to be elevated, and this meat is taken and eaten at the Sabbath table, and there's a whole mystique to it. But is this what happens today? No. Today, you go to a factory farm or to a slaughterhouse, and I actually visited a slaughterhouse to check this out. And what do you see? You see a mass production. Every 5 minutes, another cow is being slaughtered. The guy who's doing it walks up, takes his knife, makes the cut, walks away. There is no mystical interaction with the animal. There is no kavanah, which is the elevation of the energy. It's mechanical. As sincere as he may be, the shoichet, the Jewish slaughterer, is just another cog in a big industrialized machine. With chickens, they're hanging there, and you're going cut, 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 cut as the chickens are going down the line. And so in my way of thinking, the kabbalistic energy elevation that we're taught is supposed to happen, I don't see how that can happen in the modern industrialized age, where the animals are simply a product and the person slaughtering them is simply another cog in a machine. Now, in the past, meat was only eaten at special holy celebrations. You had meat on the Sabbath. During the week, most people ate vegetables. Meat was expensive. They didn't slaughter hundreds of animals every day. Even in the Torah, we find that Abraham slaughtered a calf to honor some guests. It would be eaten in a ceremonial sense. It was not eaten at a fast food restaurant or a sandwich in the traffic jam or this kind of everyday, 3 times a day, we gobble down some meat. This was not the way it happened. It was a matter of something being done in a ceremonial way. And my feeling is that in the modern world, eating meat doesn't really elevate the souls of the animals. I think it drags us down, because that's the reverse of this. If the animal is not being treated with respect, our teachings, Hasidic teachings, tell us that animal can stand before God and say, you know, as a chicken, I could have never done such and such, but this person ate me and then didn't have respect, and now I'm dragged down into road rage or whatever. So I think in this modern time, the combination of how the animals are being raised in these horrible factory farms, how they are being slaughtered in a mass production method where the slaughterer is merely a cog in the machine, and how we're really not eating meat with respect, that the best way to keep kosher is to become a vegetarian. The question of rebuilding the temple is a difficult one for a vegetarian because, of course, the temple had animal sacrifice. And on the other hand, I do ask myself whether Jews would find worshiping in a slaughterhouse to be an inspiring experience. I have personally been to a slaughterhouse, and it's very different from the little diagrams that we see in books about the temple. You're talking about ankle-deep blood, you're talking about animals mooing and cackling. It says in the Talmud, one of the miracles of the temple was that no woman ever miscarried from the smell of the sacrifices. And after visiting an actual slaughterhouse, I can understand what that means. You can smell such a place from a mile away. In the time of the temple, everyone did animal sacrifice. This was the way everyone worshiped. If every Jew who wants to rebuild the temple could actually go and stand there and look at this and see what the temple really was, that the temple really was a ritual slaughterhouse, which in that time was what people did. The Rambam, Maimonides, a 12th century Jewish philosopher, was of the opinion that the only reason we had the temple was because the people at that time were not ready for a pure prayer form of worship. They were used to having sacrifices, and that if there had been no sacrifices, the Jews would not have stayed with the Torah. So it was already in the 12th century, you have an opinion from a major Jewish commentator that says the sacrifices were not really that necessary. God really didn't need them. They were done as a concession to the people. So I have to ask myself, in this 21st century where the average person doesn't do sacrifices, where we would not really enjoy sitting there watching a bunch of animals be slaughtered as a form of worship, what would the temple be like? Well, the elder Rav Kook, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who died in 1935, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, he was of the opinion that we would have one last red heifer sacrifice to purify everybody, and then we would bring sacrifices of fruits and vegetables and unleavened bread and things like that, because it says if a man brings a sacrifice, this is what he should bring. So he was of the opinion it's not absolutely necessary to have animal sacrifice, and that the new temple would have fruit and vegetable offerings. The Torah tells us that humanity began in the Garden of Eden, in a place where we lived in harmony with all other creatures. Adam names the animals. When you name something, it means you have a relationship with it. Most of the time when we say naming an animal, we think of species, but to name an animal means to give it, an identity, to have an interaction with all these animals that Adam names. But then we are cast out of Eden, and the human race degenerates to the level of the Great Flood, where where there was robbery, there was violence. We had even degenerated into cannibalism, our commentaries say. So after the flood, God gives Noah permission to eat animal flesh. But he must pour out the blood, because that's seen as being the life or the soul of the animal. At that time, that's how they conceived it, that the soul is in the blood. Now, later on, when the Torah is given, the Jews are given commandments about eating meat, but it's surrounded it with all kinds of rules, all kinds of regulations that would teach us, if you must eat meat, this is a living thing that you're eating. Now, as we're moving toward the Messianic era, we speak of going forward to Eden. There's a journey starting out in Eden, descending into the slavery of Egypt, coming out of Egypt, receiving the Torah, moving forward to the final redemption. And the final redemption is, in essence, a return to Eden. So if we are going forward to Eden, it's not that we go back and live like cavemen. It's that we bring with us the knowledge we have gathered along the way, and we return to living in a more harmonious way with our fellow Jews, with our fellow human beings, with the creatures on the planet. And I believe that that also includes no longer eating animals, because Adam and Eve did not eat animals in the Garden of Eden. One opinion about the Messianic era says that it will happen as a sudden event. But there are other opinions that say it's a gradual process, that we are moving toward Eden, we are going forward to Eden, and that each person who takes a stand about moving themselves in that more harmonious direction adds to the cumulative collection of mitzvahs, of commandments that everyone is doing. Each time a person does one good deed, that becomes part of the world energy. We are told that the world is in a balance. Each time you do a sin, you tip it to the negative. Each time you do a good deed, you tip it to the positive. So I believe we're moving in that direction. And interestingly, there is a rise in vegetarianism among Jews in the last couple of decades. And I think that's part of this process. Many people are simply naturally losing their taste for meat because perhaps we've outgrown the need to have meat, the same way we outgrew having slaves, the same way that we outgrew having multiple wives. The Torah permits slavery, it permits polygamy, but nobody today says you have to go out and buy a slave. Nobody today says you have to have 2 wives, because although those things were permitted in that time, the ideal was to have no slavery. The ideal was to have 1 man, 1 woman. The ideal was to have us not eating meat. If we as Orthodox Jews believe that we should follow the Torah to what people would say the letter of the law, to literally fulfill all of these commandments, we have to ask ourselves, why are we not being as strict with ourselves about the commandments concerning compassion for animals and being stewards of the earth? Why are we not being as strict with these commandments as we are with things like not working on the Sabbath or wearing a yarmulke or wearing the side curls? These certain things we're very strict with, and that's not a bad thing. But I believe we become very lax about questions relating to tsar balik chayim, the suffering of animals. When I talk about what I've seen in factory farms, what I've seen in terms of how animals are being raised today, people don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. They want their beef or their chicken for Friday night. And yet we have to ask ourselves, can you do a mitzvah by committing a sin? There's a principle that says, no, you can't do that. You cannot commit a sin in order to do a mitzvah. So if it is a sin to cause the suffering of animals, and we know that these animals in these little tiny cages are suffering, they're not being treated as God would want us to treat them, then how can we do the mitzvah of eating that meat on Friday night? I believe we have a mandate, a commandment to not cause suffering to animals. Tsar balik chayim, do not cause an animal to suffer. And we should be as strict with this as we are about whether or not the food is canned in is kosher or whether the factory is kosher. We need to look at where the food comes from before it gets to that factory. And I do not believe it is kosher to eat meat from a chicken that is forced to live in a teeny little cage all its life. What does it mean to be a committed Jew, a Jew who is committed to following God's Torah? In past centuries, Jews would lay down their lives literally rather than eat non-kosher foods. In this century, perhaps we need to dedicate our lives to not eating foods which are produced through cruelty. We are supposed to be a compassionate people. We are supposed to be a people who are concerned about other people, about the environment, about living things. We are supposed to be a people who are taking care of God's earth. The bottom line is that what is on your plate affects the entire planet, and it affects perhaps the energy of the entire universe.